Hi. Today I want to talk about a little bit more about sabotage and the internal hierarchies that are set up inside the survivor in order to carry out that sabotage and how a system is orchestrated. So I want to give you a little bit more information about that. Um, Hierarchies are set up within the survivor in order to classify and arrange the system. There has to be some kind of order. They create chaos with the torture and all the parts, and so then they take the shattered parts of the child and then they align them and they teach them how to become an orchestrated internal system. The programmers have a lot of ways to arrange this. Some of the ways to train the parts that they're colors. Some of them could be metals and some of them could be gems. So this is just one way of classifying the parts inside. They will have a position of power from demonic attachments that are formed into councils. So not every color is going to be on a color council, but you can have a color council. You can have gem councils, metal councils. Typically, the councils are groups of 12. Most of the time they are. But there can be other councils with a different number of parts, and it's usually specific to the kind of programming and the kind of deities that they're connected to. And it's always an occult number that's used often. It can be difficult to get to a place of healing when you're working with gems, metals, and things like that, because they can be fused. Gems can be fused to gems. Gems can be fused to metals. The fusing happens with intense torture, and so it's difficult because you have very strong opinions and emotions that are different, but they form a new bond that makes it really hard to separate. But not for the Lord. Hard for us to understand, not for him. So sometimes you have to work with the leader of the council to find the hesitations and the concerns and what's going on for the council. You can ask the council to gather and you can talk through the issues, and you can work one by one. If you want to just work with one that's on the council, you can do that. Sometimes it even takes negotiating to get to that, because they believe if one steps away, the whole council falls, or if one steps away, they all die, So you kind of have to do some probing to figure out what they were told would happen if one of them left the council. And then you can get some truth from Jesus about whether or not that's true. Was it true then? And is it still true? Platinum is the highest level of metals, and they usually have a lot of control. Platinums can be put over color councils, gem councils. They can be put over the whole system. A gold that's high, but just slightly under the platinum, a metal that's high, is gold. So golds will be internal leaders. And if you have a gold come up to talk to you, then hey, things are shifting. There are things happening in the healing process that allow this gold to come forward, because they're trained to not communicate and not let themselves be known. So it's a really good sign if you have a part that says they're a metal, because you're getting to some really deep healing. So the example I want to give today is to talk about how a gold was formed, the system inside that was set up that the gold was put in charge of, and then how we came to find it, what triggered it, and then what the Lord had us do about it. The thing we need to know about metals is they no longer believe they're human. They've let go of their humanity because the torture was so repetitive, and they were convinced that to have a body, to be human, is to be weak and tortured and dominated. And the only way out was to rise above and separate from the body. And they can really develop a disdain for the child that is human. So they see themselves as other than that child that they came from. The programmer is trying to establish a pattern of response in the brain, and they're trying to increase the trauma with each session. So the sessions will be repeated over time. It's not a one-time event. It starts when they're little, and then it continues over time. So the torture is meant to build a pathway in the brain for the beliefs of the trauma to develop a stronghold. And it's not just that one terrible memory. You can go to the same kind of memory several times. Um, the more you try to work with the core of the person, the more healing you're going to get. So the younger and the deeper in the system that the part is, the more that healing is going to spread up the part. The worst part of having a gold set up inside is the aspect of the self-sabotage. Now, not all golds are set up to sabotage. There are some that are loyal to the occult and loyal to the programmers, and then there are some that are loyal to the self. But it can be really difficult when a gold is set up in a program of self-sabotage. They'll train the gold to repeat the trauma internally. So they experience the trauma in real life, and then they repeat it internally because it builds up emotional pressure. And they're taught to contain that emotional pressure and build it until it becomes so strong that the vibration of the child's body can open a spiritual portal. And then, human spirits, demonic entities, all kinds of traffic can flow in and out. And the front person would never know it. If you're a little farther along in the healing process, you're going to start recognizing something's off. But at the beginning, they'll have no clue that this kind of stuff is happening. Golds are internal leaders, and they're taught that they can become their own God. So it can represent a rejection of God Most High, as they were taught that he had failed them and he's weak. So they're made into the image of some kind of entity or deity. Think of the golden calf in scripture. It represented Baal. And a gold can think that they actually are Baal. Not just I follow him, not just I worship him, obey him. I have become him. I am him. And they don't know any different. And so you kind of have to ask questions and work your way to who they believe they are. And then kind of ask the Lord to say, okay, what's the difference between this part who thinks they're Baal and the actual Baal? Or what's the difference between this part who thinks they're God and God Most High? And he'll usually bring up some kind of irrefutable point that they'll go, oh. But it's a hard transition because they have worked and worked to get here. And it's been presented as something that's desirable to attain. And finding out that they've been betrayed and they've been tricked and this isn't what it was presented can be really painful for them. Okay, the internal structure is created and gold can be in charge of that. So the setting inside the person's programming can mimic the scene of the original trauma. So in the case that we're going to talk about today, and I do have permission to talk about this, it was a medical setting where the torture happened. It was like lab programming, and lab programming is particularly evil. It was torture, and sometimes it was electrocution, sometimes it was pain that was being inflicted, and the child is taught they have to split off to survive. And so they will repeat the torture and split and make a whole section of parts, and then train one of those to rise up and become the leader of it. So the gold was set up to become an internal factory for making new parts. So whenever the gold needed another part, they knew that they could go start torturing existing parts in this lab that was set up inside, and it would create more parts. And the gold ends up gaining a spiritual power, so like a reward in the spirit realm for every part that's created and every sacrifice that's done internally. And it creates a constant stream of horrific pain internally that opens up portals for spiritual traffic. But it's all behind this dissociative wall, and the presenter part won't even know it's happening until farther along in the healing. And even if they do know it's happening, they're not tapping into the extreme anguish of it. They're on the edges of it because they don't even know what they're feeling. Once that dissociative wall comes down and then you do tap into that pain, it can be extremely overwhelming. And so you want to get in and get out. You don't want to take too much time exploring that because it's horrific and it's draining. The amount of anguish can be really difficult to bear. And this kind of pain can sway the whole system, whether it's just this section or the whole person. That kind of pain stirred up can really impact everyone inside. So when the gold needs more power to accomplish a given assignment, because they're given directives, over time they'll get new directives. They can torture the parts inside, build the anguish, open portals, gain more power. And it affects the person and they don't even know what's going on. But their energy is being diverted to things in the spirit realm, and they're trying to live here in this physical life with just a fraction of their spirit power and their mental energy. And they can get easily overwhelmed in the conscious, because so much of what they need to operate is actually diverted to other agendas, other people, other places. Okay, so the person I was working with came to the session with this presenting story. She was really upset because her young child, was being bullied at school, and this was continuous. It had been ongoing for years. And the same student at school had been attacking her daughter verbally. So whenever that student felt insecure or less than, he would turn on her daughter to make her daughter feel bad so that he would feel powerful. And the teachers and principals were aware, and they were working on the situation, and yet he would still find ways to keep it happening. And she found out that the little boy was calculating his impact and was choosing to offload his emotional pain to the daughter on purpose. And it became this cycle. Whenever he'd feel bad, he'd create a situation where she would feel bad so he could offload his pain to her. So we talked through some of the options of handling it. And we talked about how her daughter needed to understand what was happening, but also we talked about how Jesus could be with her in it, and he could use this to prepare her for a heart of compassion, to always have compassion, and teach her how she wanted to treat others, and also develop her voice. So we talked about how Jesus would develop character in the daughter, and we addressed the conscious level issues that were happening to lessen her current emotions so that we could move past that and get to the event that was being triggered. And we talked about her praying a binding prayer over the little boy in the morning. Just take authority over any demonic that are motivating his behavior, so that she can feel like she's addressing the situation daily. And that was helpful. But she said she was aware that this was triggering a really deep pain inside of her. Now, there's a lot here that it could have triggered. So we did a little bit of investigation to see what was the root of what she was feeling. Who did the little boy remind her of? Did this feel like a sibling picking on her when she was little? Does this feel like an abusive parent harming her? Did this feel like a parent harming children? And she had to watch it happen. There were a lot of things that it could have triggered, and we landed the strongest idea that we landed on was it felt like a recreation of her mom harming her. And she expressed it so beautifully. She said, a mother is given inside information into the child's emotions and psyche just because of the closeness of the living situation. And it's sacred knowledge that the mother gets, so that the mother can understand the impact of situations on the child and be able to speak to the pain and speak truth into it. And that's what's supposed to happen. That's the God-given role of a mother. But in her situation, it was the opposite. The mother gathered information and used it to intensify the control and the domination in the home. She had conscious level memories. Now, this was just her normal childhood life. These were the kind of things that at the beginning of the healing process, we would work through these. Because we have to be able to find Jesus in the conscious and speak truth to the beliefs that were developed in the conscious before we can dive deep into this kind of thing. So the memories that we worked through before were she'd been beaten violently with a belt, and she'd stopped counting after 200 hits. Her whole body was bruised and swollen, and she could barely move for days. And all of that was for an incorrectly done chore, just something small. these kind of situations would happen over and over. It was her normal to have the mother in bouts of anger and rage. She would withhold food from them, demand performance. Every point that could be used as a position of power was used against the children in the home, and they were often pitted against each other. So they were spanked for the other children's behavior. It was just a mess. It was an enmeshed mess of pain. So we had worked through that, and what we were working on in this current situation, it came down to the emotions that were coming up for her now. It was being a child in distress, being shredded and torn apart on a daily basis, not being cared for or attuned to, not being offered any kind of solace. And this led to the emotions that were hidden in a ritual. So a lot of times in these families, the daily life will be the conditioning that is done to reinforce the ritual activity. And so the emotions mimic each other from both settings, but they're done on purpose to reinforce. And in this case, I believe it was infinity programming. It's a generational programming, and there's a lot of double binds. If you think of the infinity symbol, it's like a number 8 on its side. And so it feels like there's no way to get out of it. And typically it involves family in the programming, because they're taught that you can never leave family's blood. And it feels impossible sometimes to them to break that kind of programming. Okay, so the treatment in the home was reinforcing the treatment that was the ritual that was done in the lab setting. And there wasn't an authority voice in her life that was for her. Nobody was sticking up for her, no matter where she went. And there was nobody listening to her voice either. So I asked her if there was a color internally that identified with what we just described. And she immediately said gold. So that let me know we were working with a metal. And she'd been forced to watch her siblings be tortured. She was tortured to the point of death, and they were tortured to the point of death. And the parts of them were connected in this ritual. It was pretty horrific. So watching their pain intensified her own. And the mom knew that watching the pain of the siblings would increase her pain. So they were trying to create the need for the little girl to not be human. They had to separate. She had to separate from her humanity in order to survive, because it was intolerable. The torture started with a little girl part in her that was represented by pink. But the layers of the torture got more intense as they went. And it took her to death. Eventually, that was black, utterly hopeless. So there were layers all along that were created with the parts, and they were assigned colors and all that. So from that utterly hopeless black place, that's where she experienced the death ritual. And when a death ritual happens, the child is full of entities. They get pumped full of entities, but they also, when the child comes back, they imprint on the child the identity that they want the child to have. So think of it like a duckling hatching. And if the duckling hatches and there's no mama duck, it will imprint on a cat and think it's a cat. So they want these children to imprint on an identity. And so they imprint them to the entity that they're wanting them to become. Okay. So she was connected to a spirit of death, but then she was also trained to be a goddess. This gold was a goddess. So the gold was taught to repeat this abuse internally in order to stop the external abuse. So the gold agreed, the internal lab or torture room was set up, and the programmers got what they wanted, because the dissociative walls kept her from remembering that she had experienced this at all, and was repeating it nightly. And we were getting more of the picture as we talked. So it was more being revealed as we went along. She had little ones inside that were crying out in anguish every night because they were being harmed, and the gold would torment them for power. And she'd wake up exhausted and in pain and a lot of brain fog. Sometimes her body was sore. And eventually, they took the gold to a coronation ritual where she was forced to drink from a big brass bowl of ancestors' blood. And then there was an orb used, just like they use, like if you looked up a royal coronation, there's this orb of power. There was an orb in this ritual, and she was told that she was now royalty. So she was connected to Jupiter, and she was made queen of the underworld. Well, she actually called it mother of the underworld, but if you do a Google or Wikipedia search for queen of the underworld, it will come up with the goddess Persephone. So that's who this gold was taught that they were. She was told if she became this, it would actually stop the emotional pain of her brothers and sisters. So her motivation for getting this status, it wasn't power and position. It was just self-preservation and the protection of her siblings. So we had to talk about that promise not being fulfilled because she was still in pain. She could see that her siblings' lives were still exhibiting a lot of pain, and there was so much pain and death still happening in their emotional lives. The kingdom of darkness, it works in exchanges. So they'll offer something, but they don't always follow through. They offer something and they don't tell you what comes along with it. So you can ask questions like, what did they tell you you would get? Is that actually working for you? Did you actually get it? Or did anything else come with that? Can we look around and see what else is happening? What else did they give you? And a lot of times what they'll think they got is something beautiful and wonderful, and what they actually got is like witchcraft and snakes and all kinds of terrible things. So her gold realized that all of the hatred that she had for the mom in her conscious life was so strong that she wanted to die. And she knew that if she died, then her siblings would be left unprotected. So she used the connection with death then to decide, oh, it's the mom that needs to die. And so as we're talking through all this connection with death and how death is offered as a solution, it's offered as a way of escape, it's offered as a way of hope, it's offered as the rescue. And they want you to crave that and think thoughts that align with that because it gives them more power over you. So the conclusion that she came to in the session was that wishing for death was futile, because death doesn't actually bring a therapeutic benefit to anything. It doesn't solve problems. The pain is still painful. So this was setting up the stage for the gold to recognize, hey, everything I was taught about this isn't true. It's not actually doing what I wanted it to do. And there is no benefit in me being connected to this still. So the exchange that they set up for her was the power of the orb and the connection to Jupiter, the royal position, and the protection of herself and her siblings. She realized it was a hollow promise. She didn't really have power. The only power they give you is the power to continue doing what they're demanding. So she didn't really have power of her own free will. The emotions were so big on the inside from the anguish, and it was opening portals and just filling her with all kinds of spirits and bondage. So we talked to Gold about those alignments, and in the moment when she was little, her motivation was never to harm herself. So you got to come alongside the Gold and go, hey, look, I know you were given a really terrible job and you've made parts inside of you really upset, but your motivation was self-preservation. So help them understand they're not the bad guy. She never wanted to be the bully. She just needed the pain to stop, and who doesn't? So even though the Gold was loyal to the occult and harmed the self, she was actually trying to preserve self. The emotional power that got built up on the inside was through the portals then given to people on the outside who were actually harnessing her life force for their agendas. So we had to engage Gold's free will to see that this power was false. It wasn't actually doing anything for her, and it was bringing about an agenda that she actually did not want. So we got Gold's free will involved, and we asked. So a lot of times, by this time, we've done a lot of renunciations. We've worked through a lot of deliverance prayers, and so really what we're trying to do is just engage the free will, because a lot of the renunciations have been done. So I'll say, excuse me, hang on. I'll say, there it is again. I'll say something like, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ who came in the flesh. Do you renounce self-harm? Do you renounce being a royal, the orb of power, the coronation, the power from the outside? Do you renounce being connected to Jupiter and opening portals, being the queen of the underworld, and everything that was uncovered? We're just going to renounce from it in Jesus' name and separate from it and get their free will involved in it. And when she did speak her free will over all of it, we prayed a separation for the soul ties, the trauma bonds, the quantum entanglement of her and her siblings and anybody that was there, and the people and the entities that were participating. We removed the identity of the programmer from the child, because the gold, yes, it believed it was Persephone, but it also believed it was the programmer who was repeating this behavior. So we prayed off all the negative aspects, and we asked the Lord to release rivers of living water from his throne to wash away all the emotions, the entities, the programs, the people, all the connections. There's an endless supply of healing and peace that flows from the heart of God. His river can bring incredible cleansing. So we made sure to disconnect her from the planet of Jupiter. We brought back all the parts that escaped the body through the pain. We shut the portals. We brought back the parts that were using their emotional power for other realms and kingdoms, and we brought it all back to the body. And then we asked the Lord to take this internal place that was a mechanism for reprogramming and bring heaven to earth, to set up a place inside of her that was new, that resonated with the throne of God, that the foundation there would be love and moving in the power of his kingdom. And when we were praying that, you could just see the response. It was just a relief. And because of the dissociation, she didn't realize the amount of pain that she was carrying until we stepped into that. And it's shocking when you step into that emotion, but it's the grace of God that we don't live out of that absolute anguish at all times. We have evidence that it's there if we're looking, but we don't have to stay in that anguish at all times. Now, there are some people that daily can tap into that kind of anguish, and they live out of some of that pain on a daily basis, and that's how their system is set up. When there's a lot of denial, the pain gets really loud to try and get that person's attention, and it's trying to say, hey, over here, pay attention to me. So they can be more aware of the pain if their denial's high and they're not actually getting resolution to it. If they're just trying to push it aside and not address it, then it tends to get louder and louder until they finally give up and say, okay, fine, let's deal with this. Okay, so when we were praying, God came in, he made the place a meadow, and I could just see the shift that came over her. Usually when I see that shift, I'll just kind of check in with them and say, okay, now how's your body feeling now? And I'll say, can you look around inside? Can you look around that meadow? Let's just make sure everybody's got the healing they need. Is there anything left undone? And so you just give them a minute just to check and see. Sometimes they will come up with something. And if they do, then you deal with it. You try and work until you can get things settled and at peace, and then you start praying for the Lord to make sure there's no retaliation or resets of this programming on the inside. You ask him to close the portal, seal it with his blood so that they cannot be entered again. You ask for protection over yourself and over them and over everything that pertains to their life. And I ask the Lord to be our shield and our strength, because scripture tells us it's for freedom that we're set free, and he's our strong tower. So we can go into these places and tear down these strongholds, separate from entities, and remove this whole entire structure without fear.